I know that writing a thesis sentence is on your prerequisite skills. I also realize that a number of students need a brush up on thesis statements, and in my experience, this is the biggest stumbling block that I see for students, the overwhelm of the thesis statement. I'm going to demystify this, unveil the easiness of writing this sentence. I'm going to show you an example of one that is very brief, one that is a little longer, and one thesis statement that is ridiculous. So let's start with an easy one first. Want to? Let's do it. This is a short research essay about a little town called Luling, Texas. Maybe some of y'all know that town and the watermelon thump that happens every year. Let's take a look at the contents of this essay. First is the introduction. Next is a brief history of Luling and where it fits into the Texas landscape. The next paragraph includes the features of Luling, Texas, the mill and the watermelon thump and so forth. And the next is the information about the festival, the watermelon thump. And finally, the conclusion. Now, what does the thesis statement need to include? The thesis statement serves as a navigation for the reader to tell the reader what is going to be included in this essay. That's what a thesis statement is and nothing more. So we started this essay with a little bit of information about where in the world we're talking about. And here is the thesis statement. When I grew up in West Texas, Luling was considered a favorite spot for tourism, featuring, what was the next paragraph? That's right, a brief history of Luling. There it is in the thesis statement, featuring a rich history. And what came next? Attractions such as the Zedler Mills and Holly D's quilt shop. And what was the third thing? The watermelon thump. So the reader knows that what the reader is going to be reading first is a bit of history about Luling, Texas. The next thing the reader knows that they will be enjoying is the attractions. And then they know that the last thing that they will be reading will be the watermelon thump. You see how easy that is? Nothing to it. And you'll notice that the thesis statement comes a little bit into the introduction. It can be placed anywhere in the introduction that you would like. But remember that included in the introduction, it is critical that a thesis statement tell the reader what they're going to be reading. So one last time on this one. The reader knows that the next paragraph will be the rich history, followed by the attractions, followed by the watermelon thump. And as we go through, there it is, the history, followed by the attractions, Zedler's Mill and Holly D's quilt shop, followed by the watermelon thump, and finally the conclusion. See? Now let's look at one that's a little bit more complicated. Next we come to an essay that is longer. Your essays will also be a little bit longer because you're writing a multiple source essay in the semester, and that's going to be a long essay. So how in the world do we make a thesis statement out of this content? Well, before you have a little mind snap, this essay is describing, it's a position paper, it's an argument essay that explains what kind of hero Alonzo Harris is. I take the position in this essay that Alonzo Harris is a tragic hero. Why is he a tragic hero? Well, I have to prove that in the essay. And the reason that Alonzo is a tragic hero is because he exhibits the behaviors that a tragic hero also shows. Let me show you those. Here is the thesis statement for the essay. Alonzo struggles against fate, makes choices which bring about his destruction, and fails to take responsibility for the narcissistic greed that is his tragic flaw. That's it. What does the reader know from this, therefore? The reader knows that the first section of the essay is going to describe Alonzo's struggles against fate. The next paragraphs in the essay will demonstrate choices that bring about his destruction. And the reader knows that the last section of the essay shows where Alonzo fails to take responsibility for the narcissistic greed that is his tragic flaw. And that is why Alonzo qualifies as a tragic hero. Now, the fun thing is that I wrote this thesis statement after the essay was written, because I wasn't sure exactly which order I was going to place his tragic qualities. Take a look at this thesis statement a little bit closer and tell me which words I'm going to have to define for the reader. That's right, I'm going to have to describe fate, the choices, and most importantly, narcissistic greed. You just can't throw those words out there willy-nilly. You have to define it. You have to tell the reader, this is what I mean by narcissistic greed, and I have all of these vetted resources that agree with me. Okay, so let's look at how the essay played out with this thesis statement. Again, the statement's written after the essay's written, so that I don't have to go back and change it a million times when I change my mind on how things are organized in my outline. Let's take a look. As always, with a longer paper that is a position paper, I need to make sure that the reader knows what I'm talking about. Good heavens, Training Day was made in 2001. Some of my readers may have never heard of it before. Bless their hearts. But this section, then, is where I describe the plot of the story and the ultimate demise of Alonzo. And I punctuate that with images. Now you'll notice that these images, unlike the Woodstock essay, are not defined. That's because all of the images are going to come from that film, and I don't need to add a citation that says, Alonzo holds a gun to Jake's head. So the first section is the film summary. And because of the subject matter of this essay, many people say that Alonzo is actually the antagonist of the film. And so I have to prove that he's actually the protagonist of the film, because this is a buddy story. And in a buddy story, you generally have two protagonists with a number of antagonists or whatever. So that's what this section is doing. I'm proving that Alonzo is the protagonist of the story, because you just have to, when you're writing a position paper, you have to look at the opposition, and the opposition would say, no, he's not the protagonist. He's the bad guy. All right. And now that I've done all that, I get down into the meat and potatoes of the essay by using the Aristotelian definition of a tragic hero. And because Alonzo does the things that are defined in this tragic hero, therefore, he can be considered a tragic hero. And this entire section explains that within this dystopian world, Alonzo's character develops tragically as he fails the epic struggle against his fate. That is mentioned back on page. Struggles against his fate. Right? Moving on. The next section of the essay goes into the choices that Alonzo make that lead to his demise. One of the choices is that instead of driving an undercover car, I don't know if you've ever seen detectives in very nondescript cars where they just sort of blend in. No. Alonzo decides to drive a car that is souped up Monte Carlo, and that ends up being his demise, doesn't? If you've seen the movie Training Day, it does not go well for him or that car. Next is the choices that he makes about felons. Next are the choices that he makes about a situation where all is going wrong and he appears to be happy. And there's a quote for that, absolutely, because one has to use the script, the screenplay script, to quote from. Here's the second mistake, choice that he makes. And then the events that lead to his decision to have Jake murdered started later in the afternoon. And so we're going through the chronology of this second tragic mistake that he makes. And the choices that he makes cause him to underestimate Jake and think that Jake is just going to go along with everybody and thinks he's fairly weak. So where was that indicated in the thesis statement? Let's scroll back up to page 2. And that is, makes choices which bring about his destruction. The choice to drive the car, the choice to, with Roger, the choices that have to do with Jake, right? So next comes a section where we've discussed before, where I have to prove that he has narcissistic greed. So let's see where that is in the essay. Now, in order to prove that he is a narcissist, I'm going to have to go to vetted sources that tell me what a narcissist is, and I can prove that he fits that definition. Yeah, very simple. It doesn't look simple, but it's so simple that you think, gosh, this is so simple. You say he's a narcissist, you got to prove he's a narcissist, so you find Dr. Joseph Burgo. Okay, so this section explains that he's a narcissist and that his greed also contributes to his downfall. And we come to the final point, returning back to the Aristotelian definition of what a tragic hero is. The fated protagonist must die in a most violent overkill, a punishment that the protagonist cannot avoid, usually occurring as a result of his choices. Aristotle. And then the conclusion. And that's it. So as you can see, once you break it down, it's not nearly as intimidating as it seems at first. You see all the words and the pictures, you think, oh my gosh, thesis statement, and your heart starts to pound. And you find out it's nothing more than explaining to the reader in one sentence what they will be reading in the essay. Now let's take a quick look at a ridiculously long thesis statement. Let's go back to this Woodstock essay from before. As we can see, this essay is complete with an abstract, the introduction, and because this is a long paper, the introduction is not just one paragraph. The introduction needed to be longer to cover everything that's being covered in this essay. You can see the essay goes on and it's broken up into sections. And so now somehow we have to write a thesis statement that explains all this content in one sentence. We have our work cut out for us. Once again, the thesis statement was not written until the essay was finished. I would have had to change that thesis statement 100 times. The thesis is broken up into two parts. First is the festival itself. Again, some people weren't around in 1969, and they don't know about the Woodstock 1969 festival. So that is one section. The next section needs to prove that it was a success, a tragical, mystical, wonderful success. And that has to be proven. And then there has to be against all odds, was it a success? And we have to define what word? That's right, we have to define the word success. And then we say the contributing factors to this success were spiritual in nature. So those are the sections of the essay, and all of that comes into play in one thesis statement, one long sentence. Let's look at that sentence together. One of the ways that I prove it was a success is by using The Tipping Point, which is a book that describes something that happens that absolutely goes crazy. It hits just crazy numbers. Like you see something in Twitter that all of a sudden goes viral or something like that. So this is like that, only bigger. And once I review all of these sections, the power of context, the law of the few, connectors, the stickiness factor, and then I move into the spiritual explanation by combining the laws of Western esoteric philosophy to form a theory of the unexpected cataclysmic success of the most influential socio-cultural event of the 20th century, a symphony of mystical intuition, Western esoteric principles, and spirituality, including the deeper I, the deeper we, and the shared we. I know, but I'm showing you this only to show you what does the reader expect to read. First, they're going to learn about the festival itself, in case they didn't know about it. Next, they are going to see how the tipping point criteria proves that Woodstock was a cataclysmic event. And that is proved in three ways: the power of context, the law of the few, the connectors and stickiness factor, combined with the laws of Western esoteric philosophy. I'm going to learn about that. I'm going to learn about how that forms a theory of success in the most influential socio-cultural event of 20th century, which I've already proved. A symphony of mystical intuition, that section, Western esoteric principles, and spirituality, including the deeper I, the deeper we, and the shared we. That's it. That's the thesis statement. All right. I hope all that helps demystify the thesis statement and how that works within an essay. The thesis statement can move from a very simple statement, as we saw in the Luling, Texas essay. It can be a little bit more detailed when you go into the sections of a longer essay. Each section represents one phrase in the thesis sentence. And then it can turn into a larger statement in a longer essay that breaks the essay up into two parts: the success of the festival, and the second part, how in the world did that happen? And my explanation is as good as anybody else's. So that's the end of this tutorial. I hope this helps. You may certainly watch this over and over again if you'd like, move on to the other tutorials from YouTube as well. That concludes this tutorial.